Well, good morning, everyone. I appreciate you joining me on a very, very busy day in the United States Senate. Before we move to questions, I wanted to hit three topics off the top and then be happy to take questions on those topics or anything else on your mind. First, and this is something that I'll literally be leaving this session to go to a meeting with the White House, not at the White House, but with White House personnel, and that is on the bipartisan efforts on infrastructure. We all know that Virginians and Americans too often drive on roads that are in bad shape, potholes, lack of additional transportation infrastructure. We've got an aging water infrastructure with lead pipes in too many communities and water systems that are breaking down. Post-COVID, we realized that high-speed broadband connectivity is not a nice to have, but a necessity. We know as well that we need to have our power grid be smarter and more efficient. And we need to create a 21st century infrastructure for electric vehicles that will soon be on not just an exception, but become more and more the norm on our roads. So this issue of infrastructure has been talked about for as long as I've been in the Senate, yet we've never stepped up and really taken on in a once-in-a-generation effort to try to put substantial federal funding into our infrastructure needs. I'm happy to report that the bipartisan group, which I've been part of since day one, is very close to reaching a deal. We've determined that we want to see $579 billion of additional federal funding go into infrastructure over the next 5 years. That is nearly double the amount that was suggested by the earlier Republican group that had been negotiating with President Biden. We still have component parts of that deal that we need to work through in terms of allocations and which particular area, and there's still some final conversations about how we're going to pay for this kind of investment. My hope will be that we'll be able to make some more determinative announcements on this subject later today or at the latest by tomorrow. So I think good, significant progress on a bipartisan infrastructure bill that I believe will be firmly backed by the Biden White House, a step in the direction of showing that the Senate can function. That's the good news piece. The piece that's not so much good news, at least in my mind, is another piece of legislation that we will take a test vote on today, and that is the bill that's been referred to as S1 for the People Act. There is no more important component of our democracy than protecting people's right to vote. And American democracy functions better when more Americans exercise that right to vote. Unfortunately, particularly after the 2020 election and the big lie promulgated by Donald Trump, we are seeing state legislatures across the country, oftentimes controlled by far-right Trump extremists, literally go in and dramatically undermine voting rights in this country. We've seen efforts that would allow voters to be purged from their voting rolls. We've seen efforts that cut back on early voting. We've seen laws passed around the country that would literally make it a crime to give somebody a bottle of water if they've been waiting for hours in line to vote. We're also seeing this attack on democracy grow to include efforts in some states to allow those entities that count the vote to become more partisan, or to allow local governing entities, into a sense, to overthrow an election result. This is a huge concern to democracy. And the For the People Act, which, while not perfect, I do firmly support, tries to address these issues in three ways. It takes on restoring people's right to vote, to get their votes counted in a fair way, to vote in a easy fashion. We've made voting change laws in Virginia over the last year, and we had record turnouts in 2020. I think that's good for democracy. So trying to make sure people's right to vote is protected in a fair and open process is probably the most important. Secondly, what the For the People Act does as well is gets rid of partisan gerrymandering. In too many states, it is the politicians choosing their voters rather than voters choosing their elected officials. I'm proud to see that in Virginia, we at a state level have gone forward with an independent redistricting process. The S1 bill would make sure that takes place on a national basis. And let me be clear, both parties abuse gerrymandering. We need to make sure to restore people's faith in democracy that we allow the drawing of the lines to be done by independent commissions, not by partisan gerrymandering. And number three, what the For the People Vote Act does is takes on the issue of dark money. Too often, huge amounts of money are flowing into our political systems, oftentimes without even the funders of these campaigns, oftentimes negative, having to identify themselves. The S1 bill would cut back on dark money. It would overturn Citizens United. It would make sure that our financing system for our campaigns is, I think, better situated and not dominated by a few powerful interests. Again, these tools have been used by folks on both sides, and it's time to put an end to it. I'm hopeful that we will be able to move on to this legislation to at least start debating it today. I may not be hopeful on that because we would need to get 60 votes, but I am going to continue to appeal to my Republican colleagues. Let's at least start debating this bill. There is nothing more important to our democracy, and a democracy that after January 6th and with some of the misinformation that appears on social media is under assault. Let's come together at least making sure that Americans ought to have their right to vote protected and ensured going forward. So second important piece of legislation today. Third, on a slightly lighter note before we go to questions, over the last 15 months, we have seen the federal government step up in unprecedented ways to take on the challenges around the COVID crisis. We've literally put about $5 trillion of spending into programs to protect hospitals, to help small businesses, to help people who are unemployed. Probably the most extensive federal relief in our country's history. And I think for the most part, it's done a pretty good job. One area that didn't get covered is minor league baseball. And so we in Virginia have 9 minor league baseball clubs across the Commonwealth, oftentimes in smaller communities in South Side and Southwest, although we've got a great new facility in Fredericksburg. We've also got, obviously, teams in places like Richmond and Norfolk. Many of these teams, let me be clear, these minor league clubs for the most part are not owned or controlled by the wealthy Major League Baseball or Major League Baseball owners. They are oftentimes controlled by local investors. And they have been hurting. They lost their 2020 season. The 2021 season, while it is up and playing, there's going to be 20 fewer games this season. Many of these clubs have had to deal with restrictions on crowd sizes until the COVID restrictions came off. These teams are hurting. And even though we've put together a series of initiatives to try to help other aspects of small business. We did the PPP program. We did the Restaurants Act. We did even something called shuttered venues, which helped live music venues and theaters. We were not able to include minor league baseball in that shuttered venue legislation. So I've got bipartisan legislation introducing this week with my colleague Dick Blumenthal from Connecticut and Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee that would take $550 million of already appropriated COVID relief funds and claw back that money from certain programs that have not been fully utilized to put together a specific program to help these minor league teams, similar to the shuttered venues program, allowing each team to get up to 45% of their revenues from the 2019 season to, frankly, bridge them through until the next season comes on. In many of these communities, if we don't see this kind of relief, these teams may go out of existence. And in so many smaller communities, a night at the ballpark with the family is a great economic engine, but it's also, these teams oftentimes bring communities together. So on a slightly lighter note, if you're a baseball fan, follow the minor league baseball legislation we're putting in. Chances are it will have to be attached to some other piece of legislation going forward, but I'm hopeful that as we grapple with some of these very, very large pieces of legislation, we can make sure that minor league ball would not be excluded from the kind of COVID relief programs that have helped so many other industries. And just last final point before we take questions, we do ensure that the SBA will administer this program. We do ensure that none of these dollars would go to any team that is controlled by Major League Baseball. We don't want to repeat the mistake that was made in the first round of PPP, where the Los Angeles Lakers actually got some money and then had to return it. We're going to go. This is going to be directed to these small businesses, minor league teams across the country who are owned not by Major League Ball. So hopefully we'll see some progress on that issue as well. So with that, Val, why don't I turn it back over to you and be happy to take some questions.
The question today comes from Alana Austin at Gray TV.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone, for y'all's time. I wanted to ask about, apologies that it's not about a lot of the news of the day and important legislation, but about your upcoming speech that you're expected to have at the late Senator Warner's funeral. I just wanted to hear, what are some of the themes that you'll be making? What does this moment mean as far as showing that bipartisanship, and what do you hope folks take away from the legacy of his life?
Well, Alana, thank you for that question. John Warner was a great friend. He was also a role model. He was a great Virginian. I think in Virginia, we expect our public officials to tell the truth, to be humble, to step up and serve the Commonwealth and the country, always putting them first. And John Warner exemplified those characteristics. And the truth was, this was a friendship that I'm not sure could have taken place in today's environment. As you may remember, Alana, I actually ran against John Warner back in 1996. I lost that race. The people in Virginia picked the right Warner that year, and that was John Warner. After you run a race against somebody, he would have had more. The expectation is after you run against somebody, people come away from those races usually angry. John Warner was not that kind of guy. I tried to build a relationship. We ran a respectful race. After that race, I was still thinking about pursuing politics in Virginia and actually decided to run for governor. He and I built an enormous friendship. And during my time as governor, anytime there was a tough issue, fixing our state's finances, trying to deal with transportation, John Warner put Virginia in head of partisan politics. We saw that throughout his career. We saw it back in the 90s when he wouldn't endorse an extremist candidate named Oliver North in the 1994 Republican Senate endeavor in Virginia. And throughout his 30 years, John Warner served in the United States Senate. He was a leader, particularly on armed services, where he was chairman for many years. There's not a soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine anywhere in Virginia or anywhere in America that doesn't owe a debt of gratitude to John Warner. He had a great public career, but also the friendship that we developed. I always turned to him for counsel, for advice. I was so proud of the fact that in my last two elections, he publicly endorsed me and came out and campaigned for me. I saw him as recently as I believe late March. I went and visited him again. His passing is a passing, hopefully not of an era, but his message that you've got to put country and Commonwealth first is something that I try to live with each day. When I think about many of the issues I grapple with, I often think, what would John Warner do? And I'm very honored that Jeannie and the family have asked me to speak at his funeral tomorrow, and I hope I can capture a little bit of that special spirit he brought to life, that optimism he brought to everything he got involved in. I tell you, I miss him. He was a great Virginian and a true American patriot.
The next question comes from Michael Martz at the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Senator Michael Mark.
Hey, Michael.
I'm really interested in your proposal on minor league baseball. Have you discussed it with the Richmond Flying Squirrels? I think you were talking about trying to get it into the Shuttered Venue Act back in the earlier this year. Can you tell me a little bit about more how this would help these teams?
Yes, Michael. Thanks for the question. I think I have not personally talked to the Flying Squirrels management. I believe my staff has, but don't hold me to that. I know, what this legislation will do is we basically took the model from the shuttered venues. Shuttered venues was an effort to help those music venues that have had to close down, theaters, both indoor and outdoor theaters, all these kind of venues that really during COVID could not operate on any basis. We tried to make sure that minor league baseball would be included in shuttered venues. We weren't able to get that done. And so in a bipartisan way, we went out and said, let's do a special piece of legislation to help these minor league teams, which are all across America. And they range from communities like Richmond and Norfolk. I was talking to somebody in Bluefield today, Pulaski, where they built a new minor league ballpark about a year ago, or a couple years ago, that really is kind of rebirthed the whole downtown community in Pulaski. And a lot of these teams are on the very much of a financial edge. So we take $550 million where we recapture that from already appropriated COVID funds that were not used. And we allow any team to apply for these funds as long as that team is not owned in a majority fashion by a major league team. We don't want the money to go to somebody who's already financially pretty successful. But they can apply for these funds and then get up to 45% of their revenues that they had in 2019. And that can go for payroll, that can go for operating expenses, that can go for some of their contractors, and as long as it doesn't exceed $100,000 in any specific grant. None of these grants can be in excess of $10 million. We've tried to take the model that was used elsewhere and apply it to minor league ball. And my belief is that if we don't do something like this, many of these teams, probably not the Flying Squirrels, because at AAA level they're in better shape, but many of these teams, if they don't get some level of financial assistance, after they had $0 in 2020, and many of these teams are not going to even hit 60% of the revenue flow from 2019. If they go these two seasons without any support, we could lose them. And again, I don't think it'll be the case of Richmond, but some of these smaller communities, if they lose these teams with Major League Baseball restructuring their whole relationship with minor league teams, they might not come back. Yeah. The chances are, Michael, just one last point is that, we're probably not going to get this bill to the floor on a standalone basis. So we're going to need to find a vehicle to attach it to, whether it's the infrastructure bill or some of the other items that are coming up. That's our game plan, at least.
But aren't you also trying to repurpose some money from other COVID packages for the infrastructure bill?
Yes. So I think that's my point. We've kind of, with the administration, we had to get them to agree that, as well-intentioned as all of these earlier programs were, there are some cases where we overshot the mark. In many cases, because COVID, we've actually seen the vaccine kick in quicker. So the administration has agreed in the infrastructure plan to allow us to repurpose some dollars. So the idea that we could, out of those repurposed dollars, find somewhere in the neighborhood of the $550 million that we're proposing, I'm hopeful. I don't want to say it's a done deal by any means, but I am hopeful that this could be included in the package.
Okay, the next question comes from Brendan at WTKR.
Hi, Senator. Question about the infrastructure bill, and you might have addressed this previously, but just where do things stand on just Amtrak and boosting funding for Amtrak? And one of the things that they've put out themselves is a plan to boost service to areas of Virginia, including Norfolk and Hampton Roads. What do you think that would mean for the area and the state?
Well, first of all, I've been an advocate for more rail for Virginia since I was governor. And Part of that, one of those rail lines obviously includes the spur that goes through Richmond, but also to make sure that the peninsula and Hampton Roads don't get left out. I was happy to see Amtrak put forward that proposal. Another proposal that I've been a big advocate for is let's bring rail all the way down to Bristol. We've seen rail go to Charlottesville, actually include Lynchburg and Roanoke, but we need to get it throughout Southwest Virginia. So the Amtrak component is critically important to Virginia, and we're seeing some of these lines, even with limited service, be pretty successful. So we have a very healthy number in there for rail and transit. This has been an area where, unfortunately, some of my Republican colleagues, we've had to spend a lot of time negotiating because some other states don't have Amtrak. I believe if there is this bipartisan deal, it will include appropriate funding for rail. Whether the full Amtrak proposal that was laid out in the last couple of days can be fully funded, we'll see. But it will make sure, if we get this bipartisan infrastructure deal in place, communities like Norfolk, communities like Newport News will see enhanced rail service. That's good for the peninsula. That's good for Hampton Roads.
Okay, the next question comes from Caroline Tucker at NBC4.
Hi, Senator. How are you doing this morning?
Great.
Thanks so much for doing this. This question actually comes from my colleague, Scott McFarlane at Channel 4. He wanted to know, the NSA and CISA were scheduled to be at a briefing with you on January 6th with Senator Rubio to talk about solar winds, intelligence matters, and it ended up being called off around January 5th due to concerns about security on the Hill on January 6th. It looks like there may be some warnings ahead of what was going on. Do you have any background or guidance you can share with us about this at all?
You know, I actually don't. I will try to go back and ferret that out, because it's, I do recall we had a brief. We ended up having that brief after the fact, and let me go back and find whether that brief was called off because of scheduling concerns with the head of NSA, or whether it was called off because of concern in advance of January 6th. That's a great question. I think I would have candidly recalled if it was called off for that reason. I have stated this repeatedly. I was concerned in advance of January 6th, not based upon any intelligence reports, but just the vibe that was going on, the amount of stirring up that Donald Trump was doing to his followers. I contacted the FBI on the Monday of that week. January 6th was a Wednesday. I had a number of conversations with senior FBI leadership on Tuesday and Wednesday morning, including conversations that took place as the insurrectionists were in the Capitol. I personally was disappointed with the FBI's response. They repeatedly assured me that they had their act together. They were monitoring this. They had resources. Clearly, those resources did not have a full handle on what was happening. Clearly, those resources were not deployed in a timely manner. And I've raised that with the FBI, and we're still, that is still a portion of what the Rules Committee and other committees are looking at. But I do not, I will definitely get back to you. I know that briefing was scheduled, but I don't recall whether it was, whether I was affirmatively told it was called off because of concerns about the 6th.
Okay, thank you very much. I just have one other question,
Sure.
if you have time. We know Capitol Police might be running out of funding in August if supplemental spending bill isn't approved. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts are we need to get our act together and not go through another government shutdown or even potential government shutdown. Every member of the Senate, for the most part, paid homage to our Capitol Police officers who protected our lives on January 6th. You can't say, I support our Capitol Police, and then put these guys and gals out on furlough because we don't get our act together to get government funding in place. Many of the very same people who advance the big lie in Congress are the very same people who constantly threaten to shut down the government over debt limits and other kind of into the fiscal year antics. I would hope and pray that they would defer this year, that they would actually make sure our Capitol Police gets the financial support they need. I support the legislation that would dramatically increase funding for the Capitol Police. But I think you asked exactly the right question. Will these same legislators who have shown very little respect for the institution of Congress, will they continue to show that disrespect by trying to cut off funding that will hurt our Capitol Police officers at a critical time near the end of the fiscal year?
Thank you.
The next question comes from Isabel at NBC 29.
Good morning. Thank you so much for your time today. So my question is about the S1 bill. So how will the S1 bill increase voter turnout in areas like Albemarle County, and how will this act be enforced?
Well, first of all, in many ways, what S1 would do in terms of turnout and voting rights, fortunately, we've already done in Virginia. We've expanded early voting. We've made it easier to register to vote. We have made sure that that if you choose to vote in person early, or if you choose to vote by mail, in Virginia, we used to have a requirement that you had to have an excuse to get an absentee ballot. We've gotten rid of that. In many ways, Virginia's changes in our election laws that took place in 2020 followed other states like Colorado, like Oregon, like Utah. These are red states and blue states that have increased voter participation. And we had the highest turnout ever in Virginia in 2020. What S1 would do is make sure those improvements were actually maintained. Unfortunately, as we've seen in states like Georgia, Florida, chances are in Texas, because they got very close, but the governor's calling people back in special session. We have seen these states dramatically cut back on voting rights. In the case of Georgia, they make it illegal for somebody to give you water if you've waited 3 hours in line to vote. How does giving water become an illegal action? These are efforts to cut back on democracy, oftentimes to cut back on young people's participation, people of color's participation. And S1 would make sure that those state laws are, in a sense, rolled back. What S1 really does, it says, here is the federal minimum that needs to be in place to protect voting rights. I don't think, if there are individual components of this legislation that my Republican friends want to debate, let's do it. But if we want to have that debate, they should go ahead and vote to advance the bill today. The way the Senate works is, you have to get 60 votes to even start talking about a piece of legislation. Don't shut down that option. And when we see Americans' rights to vote being potentially withdrawn and taken away and undermined, this is so much more important than any traditional Democrat versus Republican issue. This is about the heart of our democracy, and it is under assault in many states around the country. So putting S1 in place, or a variation of S1 that puts a minimum federal standard, and that minimum federal standard would resemble some of the laws we've already got in place in Virginia, I think is a step in the right direction. And as I said, this is not Democrat Republican. If you look like a state like Utah, which is heavily Republican, they've put these broad voter rights laws in place for some time, and hasn't hurt the Republican Party in any means. This is really a question of, do you believe that American democracy functions better when more people vote, or do you believe we ought to go back to a time where only a narrow slice of our population votes? I firmly believe in greater participation makes more people invested in our system and keeps our democracy strong.
The next question comes from Joe Thomas at WCHV.
Senator Warner, thank you, sir, for taking time out. I was trying to decide whether it was going to be an infrastructure question or an S1 question. You helped me make my decision just there. Last year, for 45 days, Virginia registrars were collecting early votes and counting them, making it impossible for either party to have poll watchers there. Does S1 address if there's going to be early voting, there can't be early counting? And secondly, people such as myself, my Democrat colleagues will often tell me that they want to see proof of vote irregularities. Do you, returning the question around, have any proof of anyone who's actually had been denied their ability to vote? Since we're talking about making sure that people don't lose their right to vote, has anyone had their opportunity to vote denied?
Well, Joe, I think let me take those questions in reverse order. In 2020, with the expanded voting rights that the Virginia legislature put in place, I have no evidence that there were people in 2020 that were had their rights to vote restricted. But I also have seen no evidence of any major level of voter fraud take place in Georgia, in Texas, in Florida, where the Republican legislatures in each of those states have said, we need to come in and cut back voting rights because of voter fraud. There's been no evidence presented, and I would challenge you or anyone else, show me that evidence. What has driven you to so dramatically restrict voting rights? I think, as Chris Krebs, Donald Trump's director of cybersecurity, said, the 2020 election was the safest, most secure election in our nation's history. So what has generated all this backlash other than Donald Trump's big lie? And there are very few issues that concern me as much about the future of our democracy as this one. So that number one. Number two, I think there needs to be appropriate oversight on any counting of ballots. And we should debate about how that works in terms of early count. In many places, the early count was requested by both sides because you don't want, if you've got 50% of your people voting early, taking you a week to get the results because you can't start counting until Election Day. But putting in place appropriate oversight of that counting process, I think is absolutely correct. What concerns me, and again, I go back to the Georgia law in particular, and what has been proposed in Texas, is where suddenly you are giving partisan local governments or state governments the ability to come in and throw out an election if they don't like the results, or giving a local registrar or election official, oftentimes partisan, the ability to arbitrarily choose what election results to put forward. I find that extraordinarily troubling, and whether it's done by Republicans or done by Democrats. And if there are ways that we can make S1 better on oversight on early counting, I'm wide open for that. But Joe, to do that, you got to actually debate the bill. And I hope I could be surprised, but as we look at it today, I'm not sure we're even going to be able to get on the bill to start debating it.
Well, isn't Georgia's law, though, about the same as Virginia's, if not a little bit more lenient?
No. That is not my understanding. And the law, I also know in Texas, where what we've seen is in Georgia, and now even more so in Texas, where we've got these concerns like the law in Georgia precludes you from giving anybody food or water while you're waiting in line at a polling station. And we've seen in Virginia, not in so much the rural communities, but in urban communities, people wait for a couple hours in line. I think that's wrong as well. But the idea that you couldn't even give somebody a bottle of water in line, making that a criminal offense, I think is offensive. But we've seen this effort even go farther in some of the Texas legislation.
Okay, and that is actually all the time we have today for questions.
Well, let me just close with this, and appreciate everybody being on the line. I guess I'd end up saying is, on infrastructure, I think we're going to get a bipartisan infrastructure deal. I think it'll be good for Virginia, good for America. I'm pleased that my Republican friends have negotiated in good faith. My hope will be that the Minority Leader Mitch McConnell will not then try to scuttle the plan just because it's making the kind of $579 billion of new investment in infrastructure that we all know we need. There's not anyone that I'm aware of that doesn't think our roads, our water and sewer, broadband, a smarter, cleaner electric infrastructure isn't necessary for this country. This is a long-term, once-in-a-generation investment. Good news there. On voting rights, I am afraid that we may not even get on this piece of legislation today because at least the expectation is all 50 Republicans in the Senate won't even want to debate it. I find that very disheartening, particularly in terms of, when I think back to Alana's first question about John Warner. When the Senate was full of John Warners, I could not imagine him not being part of a group that would say, I may not agree with everything in this bill, but let's get on the bill and at least debate it. And then on the issue of minor league ball and to the 9 teams from Bluefield and Pulaski and Danville and Richmond and Norfolk, Fredericksburg, I'm going to leave out some and make a political flop. I start going down this list. I hope we're able to get this little bit of help that will make sure that throughout Virginia, not just this year, but next year and for future years, springtime will always be greeted by an umpire yelling, "Play ball." I think it's important for our local communities, both economically and for their sense of community. Thanks, everybody. Be well.